All right, in this one we are talking about constrained generation. How do we constrain the outputs to actually produce better and different results for these LLMs? Constrained generation is a powerful technique in the AI prompting world that allows users to set specific rules or limitations on the AI's output. For the rest of this video, let's explore the concept of constraint generation, its applications, and how to effectively implement this into your prompts. Let's break down 4 reasons on why you would actually use constraint generation. Number 1 will be increased specificity. Constraints help narrow down the AI's vast knowledge to precisely what you need. It knows so much, sometimes you don't want it to know so much, you just want it to hone in. Number 2 is going to be enhanced creativity. Oftentimes, paradoxically, limitations often spark a more creative solution. I didn't know that in the beginning. It's a fun one. Number 3 is going to be improved control. You have actually more influence over the structure and content of the AI's output. And then number 4, task-specific outputs. When you add constraints, it can align the AI's response with particular formats and requirements. All right, let's move on to the actual types of constraints I often use. The first one would be a structural constraint. I like to let it know the format or structure that I want it to output. An example of this would be like, write a haiku about artificial intelligence. The second type of constraint would be a content constraint. I like to specify what information should or shouldn't be included. For example, maybe I would say something like, explain quantum computing without using technical jargon. The third type of constraint would be a linguistic constraint. What do I mean by this? So I like to actually set rules on what kind of language that it can actually use. For example, I could say, describe a sunset only using words that start with the letter S. This is actually a really fun one. It's weirdly good at these kind of activities. It's fun. Number 4 type of constraint would be logical constraints. So you can do things like impose rules that require logical thinking or problem solving. A cool example of this would be create a murder mystery where the culprit is never explicitly named but can be deducted from the clues. An example of this would be create a murder mystery where the culprit is never explicitly named but can be found from the clues. Number 5 is going to be quantitative constraints. This is probably my most used one. It's simple, but it's so effective. I like to set numerical limits on outputs. What do I mean by this? I could say, summarize this article in 50 words or less. I could say, write a paper that's 100 words. I can say, write 3 paragraphs. Just adding a little bit of numbers and constraints has a beautiful effect on your prompts, and it gets you exactly what you're looking for. So let's now move on. Let's talk about some techniques for effective constraint prompt generation. When dealing with these kind of prompts, and any kind of prompt honestly, it's always important to be specific and clear. Clearly define your constraint, leaving no room for misinterpretation by the AI. Number 2, it's actually really beneficial often to combine multiple constraints. You're able to layer different types of constraints for a more complex and interesting output. Number 3 is the ability to use persona-based constraints. You can ask the AI to respond as if it was a specific character or type of persona. We talked about this earlier in our course about personas, so you can actually use a persona as a constraint as well. For example, maybe you could do something like explain the theory of relativity as if you were a 5-year-old. Fourth technique would be maybe something like a purpose-driven constraint. You can frame your constraints around a specific goal or purpose. An example of this would be write a podcast description that would appeal to eco-conscious millennials. Number 5 is going to be refinement. Always start with more broad constraints and gradually add more specific ones to get the desired output that you want. It's better to start wide and hone it in. All right, I want to go over a couple more practical applications of constraint generation to keep that brain turning and to lock this in for you. First example would be something maybe like a creative writing prompt. So you could do, write a 6-word story about a time traveler. Each word must start with a different letter of the alphabet. Now that's some fun creative writing and a lot of constraints. AI is really good at this kind of stuff. Another good example would be maybe a data analysis kind of constraint prompt. You could say something like, analyze the data set and provide insights using only bullet points. Each bullet point must be exactly 10 words long. Or maybe let's talk about a problem-solving prompt. You could do something like propose a solution to urban traffic congestion without mentioning cars, buses, or trains. Last one is going to be a summarization prompt. So let's add some constraints to the summarization. You could do something like summarize the research paper in 5 sentences. Each sentence must contain exactly one technical term, which you must define in parentheses. Alrighty, that wraps it up for constraints. I use constraints literally in almost every prompt. It's important to tell it what you want and everything like that, but then you need to tell it what you do not want. That is just as important. That's how you get honed in answers. That's how you make it, replicable over time. With that being said, see you in the next module.